I am live. I read yesterday out of the Laird and the Lady chapter 5, New Year's Eve. And the last 10 minutes or so, my voice is all stuttery. So I'm going to continue from when I stopped the last recording. None of them would listen to a woman against the sound of the pipes. The double doors were flung open, and a surge of the pibroch filled the room. Why did I think that Robbie was old? Robbie is the only person who doesn't resent my being here, the only person who isn't afraid of the Emilie that everyone else pretends to ignore. She watched him slowly pace 3 times round the table, then stand behind the chair of his liege. Sandy stepped forward with a glass of neat whisky, which is the due of the piper. Robbie gave the toast of fealty and handed Sandy the now empty glass. Rowan, the Gaelic, smooth and authoritative in his mouth, affirmed their loyalty to a shared heritage. Applause broke the tension which Marylda had found almost unendurable. The present rushed back as water smooths footprints from sand. She saw Robbie, the pipes tucked under his arm, stride out through the door held open by his servitors. The clapping dwindled. Even the most obtrusive foreigner realized that in some inexplicable way they had committed a breach of taste. They clapped, said Alistair, in what he believed to be an inaudible whisper. They clapped as though Robbie was a bloody cabaret. Conversation sprang up like weeds which strive to conceal the indecency of rubble. I continue chapter 6. The Rocking Horse Rocks. The Americans were bewildered that although at 9:15 only the house party were assembled in the hall, at 9:30 they had been joined by another 40 men and women who were obviously close friends of the host. To add to their difficulties, the men who wore the same tartan as Rowan were usually introduced by the name of their houses: Cairdry of Finlaurig, Cairdry of Rothy, Cairdry of Ballymachan, and the others had equally unpronounceable, though glamorous titles. The 3 American men, who until now had bolstered their social courage with a comfortable patronage of grown-ups at a children's fancy dress party, fingered their white ties and regretted they could so easily be mistaken for waiters. Their social unease increased when each was assigned a partner. Were they expected to dance the Lancers, and if so, how was it done? Maisie made up her mind to tell Marylda that in future she could at least tip off her relations as to the proper drill among the curious barbarians into which she had married. At precisely 9:45, Sandy opened the front door and the tenants streamed into the house, 327 of them. Led by the pipes of Robbie, they joined the procession through the main rooms of the castle, the strangers feeling a little foolish, as though they had been unexpectedly invited to join in a game of oranges and lemons. As they reached the ballroom, the skirl of the pipes was taken up by the 6 pipers waiting on the days, and the 200 who had been warned that they were to join in the first 8-some reel took their places on the floor, while the rest sat primly on the hired gilt chairs which lined the walls, men on one side of the room, the women opposite. Maisie was relieved that Marylda had told her that there were other chairs in the musicians' gallery, where those who preferred to watch from this vantage point could retreat. She frankly admitted that for colour and movement she hadn't seen anything until she came to the Highlands. No wonder their women are obedient, she thought ruefully, when the men can outdo them even in clothes. Not that Marylda doesn't dance as well as any of the others, but I bet she had to practice plenty. It must be a paradise for chaperones, said Marylda to Alistair, who was unashamedly mopping his forehead after a courageous attempt to master the rumba. Don't you believe it? I remember my wife looking through the window of the room where our tenants have their monthly dances. One of my gillies, who didn't recognize her, patted her on the shoulder and whispered, "Run away Home, my lassie, or you'll be stretched upon the gorse. And true enough, for there's a hot fire under all their formality, as no doubt you've already discovered with that husband of yours. She laughed. Certainly I've not been neglected. He kissed her hand. And if ever you are, you let me know, and I'll give the boy a few words to remind him what he's missing. Don't they ever loosen up in public? Sandy told me a few minutes ago that they've got through 4 dozen whiskey already, and that's nearly a quarter of a bottle per head, for the women are drinking port or champagne cup. By midnight most of them will be adequately drunk, but I shall be most disappointed if any outsider could know it. But try not to dance a reel except with one of us, whose cellars have permitted us to practice holding our liquor after midnight, for I remember the bruises on my wife's arm after ate some with one of our gillies. It's the sharp corners of the 4 buttons on the sleeve that are very destructive to a woman's bare arms when they twirl you around. Emilie was so cross when it happened to her that she went upstairs in a sulk. Damn it, perhaps that was the last straw which made her run off with that dreadful fellow Gaston. He mopped his forehead again, embarrassed at having forgotten that in speaking of Hector's wife, he was also reminding Marylda of her aunt. There's champagne in Georgina's sitting room for those of us who need a refresher, she said lightly, and hoped that he didn't guess that this mention of Emilie could not have been made at a more difficult moment. The clock had again reminded her that there was little time in which to steel herself for an ordeal in which she must be free of time. In half an hour she must stand at the great door with Rowan to welcome the new year. But it must be a real new year, free of ghosts, free for a son to be born who could walk even at midnight down a dark corridor without fear. As though aware of the timbre of her thoughts, Alistair said, "Who is going to bring in the new year?" She had intended to ask Bruce Coynach. His eyes and hair were dark enough, and he was sufficiently solid not to be affected by the undercurrents manifest in the house. But she heard herself saying, "Rowan's going to do it. What's the use of being married to a black Highlander if he can't bring in the bread and salt? And the coal, too, mustn't forget the coal. Going to be a hard winter if I know the signs, and now that these damn bureaucrats are making a muddle of the mines, we shall need every bit of warmth we can get. So you agree that Rowan should bring in the new year?" He hesitated. Hector had always been the dark man, and it might upset Georgina if she saw Rowan playing the same role. Silly to be so superstitious. Georgina was far too sensible to be upset by a coincidence. Of course Rowan should be the first to cross the threshold, he said, with unnecessary heartiness. Lucky for a man to open the door of his own house. Clever, if you think of it. Good omen. Probably get us a decent government before the end of the war. I will go and tell Rowan. Of course, he won't be able to change the plan if he has already asked Bruce. She found Rowan talking with Mr. Henderson, the minister, in the dining room. "Darling, can I have a private word in your ear?" He smiled down at her, and they withdrew to the far side of the room. "Alistair thinks, and so do I, that you ought to be the dark man." For a moment he seemed reluctant. "I meant to brief Bruce, but if you'd rather have me—" "Always you, darling. Please remember that I'd always rather have you, for everything." He smiled and tweaked her ear affectionately. "Then I shall stop being jealous of Duncan. The poor devil's been gazing at you like a spaniel all the evening. Not that I blame him. Who wouldn't be in love with you? Please don't be jealous of Duncan. Please, darling." The urgency of her voice reawakened suspicions he had dismissed. Surely she wasn't really interested. Not that he distrusted either of them. But it would be damned awkward to have to tell Duncan to keep away from the house. "I won't be jealous so long as you don't give me cause." She tried to smile as though his remark had no significance. But why had he used those words, the same words that Hector had spoken to Emilie? Had Emilie been in love with Roderick? She saw Duncan coming to look for her and remembered that she had promised this dance to him. The beat of maracas was suddenly menacing as drums that announced the imminence of magic. She couldn't pretend to Duncan that she was enjoying herself, and if he knew she was frightened he would try to stop her going alone to Emilie's room, and if Rowan suspected that there was a secret between them, he would be hurt. And tonight it was vital to avoid misunderstandings. "Duncan, darling, I'm terribly sorry to cut your dance, but I must go up and see what's happened to Maisie. She said she had a bit of a headache, and I told her to find the aspirins in my bathroom cupboard." She released her hand with obvious reluctance. That was not lost on Rowan. "Oh, leave Maisie. She's been knocking them back a bit, and I think a couple of Alka-Seltzers would be nearer the mark." He followed her to the foot of the stairs and said urgently, "Darling, I know you are up to something. Emilie's trouble? For God's sake, hang on to yourself and don't tune in." It was difficult to lie to him, but she hoped her laugh sounded convincing. "Can't a poor woman go up to fix her makeup without you having unworthy suspicions?" "All right, pretend there's nothing up if you must. But remember, I'm here if you want me, and don't try to tackle anything tricky alone." For a moment she hesitated. Couldn't she ask Duncan to meet her in Emilie's room after midnight? Why shouldn't she have a little flirtation with him? She felt suddenly gay and provocative, but as she saw the excitement in his eyes, realized that again she had been thinking and acting as Emilie. She ran upstairs and left him staring after her, his face a revealing study of anxiety. It seemed unnaturally cold in her bedroom, although someone had remembered to make up the fire and steam was hissing in the radiators. Her hands were shaking as she put on rouge, so that Rowan should not worry because she was pale. Should she take more triple bromide? No, for soon she would need all the extra vitality she could command. She remembered the bottle of champagne in Rowan's dressing room. There was still more than a third of it left, and she poured out a glass and drank thirstily. "Luckily I was careful not to drink anything since dinner, for it's now that I need it." As she came into the hall, Sandy was carrying in the silver punch bowl that steamed with a mullet claret which would toast the new year. People were crowding in from the drawing room where they had gathered after the last dance. "5 minutes to go," said Alistair, looking at his watch. "Rowan's gone out to wait for the clock to strike. You stand at the door to take the tokens from him. Sprinkle the salt on the bread and then hand it to Georgina, and she'll pass it round." "Are you feeling all right, darling?" said Georgina, anxiously, and at Marylda's smile, silently upbraided herself for being a fussy old woman who allowed herself to be upset by the coincidence of Rowan playing the part that she had watched Hector fill on a certain other midnight. At the first stroke of the clock, Rowan knocked on the great door and waited for Marylda to open to him. Georgina instinctively grabbed Alistair's arm, and he patted her hand consolingly. No wonder she was upset. Devilish like his grandfather the boy looked. Not that there was anything odd in their perfectly natural family resemblance. And Marylda's likeness to Emilie was entirely superficial. Damn it, why shouldn't the girl look like her aunt? What was Georgina muttering to herself? Don't let the pattern repeat itself. Better see she had a stiff drink. Getting superstitious in her old age. Not that all the Cadrys went too fey for their own good. He blew his nose with unnecessary violence and walked towards the punch bowl. And I stop this here because I think the battery has drained again. Happy Saturday.